welcome back to the last two sessions for our conference, Imagine Futures, hosted by the Center for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender under the Just Leaders program. This next session will be had by Pierre Brouard, who is our Deputy Director, and I'm just going to read his bio for you now. So Pierre Brouard is the Deputy Director of the Center for Sexualities, AIDS and Gender at the University of Pretoria, and he is a registered clinical psychologist. He has worked in HIV since the mid-1980s and at the center since 2001. Pierre is the Secretary of the Sexuality and Gender Division of the Psychological Society of South Africa, has co-authored a protocol for the university, which we spoke about earlier, and on trans inclusivity, and is a member of the Southern African Sexual Health Association. He helped to develop and run workshops on sexual harassment for the University of Pretoria and is part of a team of psychologists who ran a 5-year transformation, diversity and inclusion project at Johannesburg High School. I thought it said that ran a marathon for 5 years. That would have been interesting. So thank you so much for being here today. We look forward to hearing from you, Pierre. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Whenever the bio says I started working in HIV in the early 1980s, I realize how much that ages me. I think it's 40 years almost to the day since we first knew about HIV, and I've lived through all of those 40, so it's a pretty remarkable journey. There's an old theatre saying that if there are more people on the stage than in the audience, then you know you have to worry. But I think we've just got enough people in the audience to not worry about that particular concern. So thanks for the invitation to be here. I feel I must make some disclaimers and set out some caveats because I was, in a sense, asked to do this presentation on behalf of someone else who wrote a monograph for the center. Her name is Maria Romalo. She's head of our disability unit, and the monograph she wrote is called Disabling Higher Education. So I do feel a little bit like an imposter to be speaking here because I'm not a person living with a disability, and I don't claim to speak for people with disabilities or for that community or the communities, I suppose, of people with disabilities. But hopefully I speak today as an ally, and I acknowledge my own privileges, particularly around being able-bodied. But I also know that all of our identities intersect, and as a gay person, I have experienced forms of discrimination. So hopefully that allows me to achieve certain amounts of empathy and connection to what it feels like to be othered in some way. I think hopefully this isn't a controversial view, but I think that people living with disabilities exist on multiple spectrums or spectra of identity, and perhaps there is no single story of living with a disability. So what is the higher education context briefly? There'll be a little bit more on this later, but what Maria suggested that how universities think about and define and approach disability will determine who gets to be considered a student living with a disability. So how they define it, of course, frames in how they might work with those particular students, and who gets to get reasonable accommodations. I think the telling word there in that phrase is reasonable, and I'm sure many internal and external debates have been held about what that means. It's also worth noting that our universities are often based on ideas that we should be able-bodied and have high levels of ability, that we should strive for perfection and high levels of achievement, and that anything that hints at an inability is frowned upon. So I think there is something that is set up and how we think about higher education. And many institutions, ours included, for example, will highlight the achievements of their students as selling points and as a result of the efforts of the university community. And I suppose there's something interesting there about, is there something about the ethos of higher education that is at odds with the lives and stories of people living with disabilities. So she argues that our institutions are systematically ableist, and the fact that a lot of the transformation work, which often frames disability work, is aimed at or based on ideas of numbers. So have we brought X numbers of people with differences and diversities into our institutions, rather than thinking about access to power, for example? Do those bodies that come into our institutions actually transform them if we focus rather obsessively on numbers? And perhaps a lot of our transformation and diversity and inclusivity work has focused on the concept of tolerance rather than dynamically shifting the power structures inside an institution. So she makes the point that our institutions are structurally ableist in the sense that policies and practices, in fact, will perpetuate certain differences and power inequalities. In fact, the entire system may work adversely for students with disabilities. And considering that we have a history of exclusion and oppression in South Africa, we have to see all students and all the bodies in our institutions as sort of tangled in multiple identities. And so this monograph, and I would imagine this work, locates itself in an intersectional understanding of identity, which is grounded in critical theory. So the title Disabling Higher Education has been adopted to think about two things. Firstly, it views higher education as having been disabling towards persons with disabilities through forms of structural ableism, but also that the monograph itself intends to try and disable this ableism by the interventions that it suggests. And perhaps we could have a little bit of a discussion about that later, about what actually that could mean. The monograph adopts a social justice approach, so it recognizes the importance of concepts of impairment, identity, human rights, culture, and capabilities. And I think here the word culture doesn't only mean culture in its more narrow sense, as we sometimes think about it in South Africa in terms of ethnic culture, but perhaps also the idea of cultures that might, and subcultures that might exist inside an institution. I don't know if any of you have read the book by Andrew Solomon. I think it's called Far From the Tree. It's based on the phrase, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, which is often a phrase that we invoke when we think about how alike children are to their parents. And the point that he makes in terms of focusing on a range of identities, including people living with autism, people who belong to the deaf community, people who are queer, is that often they inhabit cultures which are very different from their parents. So if you are a deaf child of hearing parents, in some ways you belong to a whole community of people that is so separate from that of your parents. I think the idea of cultures is very fascinating to think about there. And a social justice approach assumes that students' abilities and rights to contribute to the intellectual space is affected by dominant institutional norms. So you need to think about those norms in terms of how you frame your work. It also, the social justice approach also argues that we need to address the barriers that hinder or prevent or stop or inhibit the full inclusion of students who are living with disabilities, and that this work needs to be attitudinal, cultural, structural, political, and organizational. So the view taken by this monograph writer is that disability remains an exclusionary space in many of our institutions, and that the way that our institutions have tried to manage disability is fragmented and sometimes separate from the project of transformation work. And to this end, one of the main approaches that institutions have adopted is to set up so-called disability units to accommodate students living with disabilities. And in fact, Maria is, as I said earlier, the head of ours at UP. But in fact, one of the many challenges of these disability units is that the kinds of services that they offer across institutions differs considerably and will depend very much on the kinds of skills and specializations that the staff have that work in those units. So, in fact, the students who come into our institution and rely on these units are, in a sense, at the mercy of the staffing of those disability units. If they are inadequately staffed, then of course that will have a knock-on effect. And so what is offered to students is very much predicated on how those units are staffed. Usually, our universities will have policies around disability, and they will focus on forms of inclusion. But in fact, the bare minimum of being able to provide sign language interpreters across our institution and institutional spaces and offerings is often quite limited. So how can we speak to inclusion if we don't even offer those basic services? And in fact, I think I was speaking to one of our sign language interpreters on the way to lunch, and we were talking about whether this shift to online, which came with COVID, had worked to the advantage of students with disabilities or disadvantage. And it seems like, we could explore that in the discussion, but it seems that for some students the situation is worse in terms of what is offered to them. So students, in fact, often will choose an institution not based on the kind of course they want to study, but in fact what the institution itself offers them. So that already shapes and frames the kinds of options that they might have. There is a policy from the Department of Higher Education and Training, which is about trying to improve access and success, but it remains to be seen, I guess, how successful this policy is. So what are some of the theories of disability that the monograph rests on, if you like, and critiques and builds on? I think one of the earlier models is the so-called charity/religious model of disability, which saw disability as, in some ways, as the will of a higher being, and possibly even the result of some form of punishment. And I suppose ideas like that still might persist today, even in our sort of ordinary lives. We know if a child is born with a disability, or a mom has bad luck during her pregnancy, we might frame that in certain understandings of higher powers or beliefs which help us explain and understand that. And in this kind of model, persons with disabilities are seen as victims, as beneficiaries, often as helpless, as lacking power and autonomy. And this has a disabling and exclusionary effect. The medical model, which I think subsumed the charity model or religious model, is probably still with us in some forms today and may exist in parallel to other understandings. And the main focus here is on pathology and impairment. And people with disabilities are considered to be different from a certain standard of normal. And this results in othering and a kind of grouping of people according to their impairments. And I suppose a note of complexity here is the point I made a bit earlier about people living within the deaf community, for example, do find a kind of a belonging because of their shared impairment. But even within that, there are debates, for example, about cochlear implants and whether this, in fact, is a rejection of deaf culture and, in fact, pushes often young people and maybe their parents into deciding, do I want to take that something away from the child by doing a particular kind of implant and turning a child who is deaf into someone who is hearing. The medical model has been criticized for, in a sense, being acontextual and asocial and not looking at the kinds of barriers that prevent young people from accessing higher education. And it doesn't necessarily see that our institutions and the way that they are set up may exacerbate the situation or worsen the situation of students with disabilities. The social model of disability grew out of the disability rights movement, which was really setting itself out as critiquing the medical model. And it adopts a more social constructionist analysis, seeing disability in the context of ableism and the kinds of barriers that may prevent a person with a disability from fully accessing an institutional space. So it really tries to see the disability in the context of the social and the structural. And it views persons with disabilities as agents of change, of their own destiny, and it tries to challenge dominant discourses that view people with disabilities as inferior or dependent in some way. In an educational context, it suggests that rather than trying to necessarily focus on helping only the individual, that we should try and change the system or the social context so that the person's ability to navigate their way through university life is enabled or made easier. And in fact, it's probably true that a number of our institutional policies around disability do in fact acknowledge that we need to think about the broader system and not only focus on the individual. But the model itself has been critiqued for its overemphasis of environmental factors and perhaps overlooking certain individual characteristics. And this is where the social relational model offers another layer to our thinking about disability, and it sees impairment as both personal and social, and that in fact an impairment only becomes significant when the context makes it so. And so it views as important the necessity to empower individuals rather than seeing them as passive recipients of services and assistance. And linked and sort of folded into this approach is the capability approach, which thinks about students with disabilities in a relational way and thinks about the education system as responding to the whole diversity of students. And it views students living with disabilities as capable and able if the system makes it so. The human rights model evolved out of an understanding that certain rights accrue to all of us and indeed to people living with disabilities, and thinks about economic rights, social rights, and cultural rights, and has drawn a lot on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and it builds on the social model of understanding disability. And it recognizes that disability itself is an evolving concept, and it depends on the interaction between a person and their environment. And so it adopts an inclusion focus and really looks at ways in which the person living with a disability is seen as part of and integral to an institutional space. But critics have argued that this model is very similar to, in fact, the social model. So does it offer anything new in terms of our understanding or the kinds of interventions that we might arrive at? Critical disability theory, which is probably a more sort of contemporary view, although you can see that, of course, these aspects of these models do overlap with each other, emanates from critical theory, and it argues against a medical understanding of disability and recognizes that cultural, social, historical, and political ideologies affect how we think about and understand and respond to disability. And of course, it draws on other forms of critical theory, such as race theory, feminist theory, and queer theory. It sees disability as a lived reality, as a fact of life, and linked to access to resources, to power, to services, to inclusion. And it sees disability as folded into and dependent on existing social power relations. In the context of education, discriminatory structures, practices, and perceptions are seen as deeply ingrained in educational systems. And in fact, they can subvert often these very noble policies that we have. So it really asks us to critically think about policies and ask ourselves, do they, in fact, I guess, address the more hidden agenda, the hidden curriculum of ableism? And it argues that, in fact, if institutions don't do this, paradoxically, they become instruments of institutionalized ableism. 10 minutes. Note to self, speed up. So ableism is a term which probably this audience would understand intuitively, but really draws on similar ideas such as racism, ageism, and sexism, and I guess speaks to the idea of the normativity of being able-bodied, and that this is assumed as the default of being human. And critical disability theorists argue that institutionalized ableism is about the systematic, the ways in which the structures and ways of being and doing of an institution systematically discriminate against persons and students with disabilities. And linked to this idea is the idea of internalized ableism, which is, I suppose, where you take in the negative views of societies and systems and to some extent either limit your own horizons or it might affect your own sense of self-worth. As a gay person, I understand that idea very well, that perhaps something I've had to grapple with most of my life is internalized homophobia and ways in which I might think of myself as second class or lacking worthiness or maybe even not deserving of say, happiness in a relationship setting. I thought it would be interesting, just as a side note, this isn't in the monograph, but it is a term or a theoretical view that has intrigued me because just the word crip theory is, it's obviously taking a negative word, a pejorative word, and taking its power back. It's a bit like the word queer. When I grew up, queer was an insult, and now it is an indication of fabulosity, perhaps. And so crip, of course, drawing on the word cripple, which is an unacceptable term. But crip theory sees disability as an identity, as a viable identity. It's not something that is less than, but it is just your part of who you are as a human being. And that this intersects with all other aspects of who you are. But it also understands that even within the disability space, there will be discriminations. So even like in queer spaces, racism and ageism and sexism will live and are alive and well. Even within spaces of people living with disabilities, there will be gradations of discrimination. And one could also think about the impact there of internalized ableism. So the use of the term disabled people is done intentionally in proponents or people working with crip theory. And crip theory also rejects disability hierarchies, which is also something I think for those of us who are coming to disability work from an able-bodied space, we might have unconscious bias about gradations of severity and how hard it could be to live with different kinds of disability, and maybe unconsciously we see some as better or worse than others, and maybe that is some of the work that we can do as allies. In terms of thinking about higher education spaces, I did talk a little bit earlier as a critique that some of the transformation work, in fact, has sidelined disability work and hasn't in a sense taken it into its own workings and space. But if we're thinking about transformation itself as an imperative, it is of course itself a complex project, as any of us would know working in institutions that have been on this transformation journey of the last decade or more. So it's multi-layered, and conventionally the work involves looking at forms of governance, the demography of our spaces, who are the bodies, how do we change the nature of who is in our institutions, what we teach, how we teach it, what kind of research we do, the kinds of vision and mission we set out for ourselves as an institution, and how we want to deal with questions like access and inequality. Crane Sudeen has said that mostly our transformation work has adopted two broad approaches, which probably overlap. One is an emphasis on the demographic shifts, and the other is on looking at questions of privilege and power. I'm sure most of us in the room would argue we need to do at least both of those. But transformation itself, never mind work around people with disabilities, is a site of conflict. There's resistance, there's co-option. The language of inclusion is often used in superficial ways. We often don't really address structural inequalities meaningfully. And disability policies are often quite paternalistic. And students with disabilities and what we do for them is framed as special privilege. And we view a little bit like going back to the religious model, people with disabilities are seen as vulnerable. And when you position people as vulnerable, there's a power dynamic operating in that terminology. I've just got a few more slides, so I'm nearly there, must wrap up. if we look at, in fact, the representation of people and students with disabilities in South African higher education space, less than 1% of the total student population is made up of students living with disabilities. So this speaks to pervasive exclusion in the sector. And we note, the monograph notes that for learners coming from a school context to come to a university, often the challenge is that, as I suggested earlier, it might depend on the kinds of the ways that those universities offer services to students with disabilities. And also sometimes students with disabilities are seen as learning disabled. That may be a part of the subset of people with disabilities, but it then says that this sort of notion of impairment might mean that they can be dissuaded from taking up a course of their own choice. So in fact what happens is that there's a limit to what students can achieve or are allowed to achieve in our university settings. And quite a lot of the disability work and the disability offerings inside an institution are dependent on self-disclosure. And for students living with more invisible disabilities, this raises questions about what do I say, when do I say it, should I say something? Because I can only get the service of the unit if I say that I have a disability, but perhaps the idea of coming out as a person with a disability is a journey of itself, and maybe you feel forced to do so. So that kind of forced disclosure is I suppose, psychologically potentially quite a damaging thing to do. And so what the end result is that some students may attempt to approximate able-bodiedness as a way of fitting in. So I think the last two slides, what are some of the barriers? I think apart from the sort of ideological and theoretical assumptions that are embedded in many of our institutional spaces, there are clearly physical barriers. The disability units themselves are often poorly or inadequately resourced. They're kind of the poor cousin of the transformation or inclusivity space. There are obviously barriers to teaching and learning. I think even with the COVID response, we've seen how many lecturers had to struggle to learn new skills to be able to do their work online. And there are barriers to throughput, to actually getting students from A through to the B of completing their degrees. In terms of ways forward, and perhaps this is where the conversation can go in the room, is that we need to really think of meaningfully creating institutional momentum towards universal access in all systems, processes, and structures at operational and strategic level. We need to rethink our models of understanding disability to move away from ableism. We could try and address internalized ableism and whether our work is paternalistic. We need to think about how we teach, the methodologies of teaching, that ways in which they could become more creative, more inclusive. We need to think about how we make our disability units meaningfully capacitated. And the suggestion is that if we adopt a social justice approach, we keep our eye on the idea that this isn't about just feeling sorry for people learning with disabilities, or that the little bit that we do are like the crumbs that people should accept, but rather that this is the right thing to do. And in a country with a constitution like ours, justice is important. Justice and redress and acknowledging the history of an inadequate response is important. And I think that's it. Thank you very much for listening to those ideas.
Thank you so much, Pierre. That was really illuminating, and I think it's always really important to state your positionality, and we really appreciate that it's a lesson to us as well, because we do have allies, we do have insights, and at the same time we do try to make sure that we're not speaking on behalf of people, but we're sharing our reflections based on our positionality. So we really respect and appreciate that. We're now going to open the floor up to questions. We currently don't have any questions online, but maybe some of the people we pose questions to in the venue would like to comment or respond to some of the questions you put forward to us.
And maybe also just to say, I'm not standing here as the expert, and let's rather see this as a conversation between us. I think you have a hand.
I'm curious as to which faculties at the moment have opened up to, my question is not being phrased right, which faculties allow disabled people or have courses available for disabled people to participate in, and maybe is there a restriction as to what type of disability certain faculties are allowed to accept?
I 100% cannot answer that question. I don't work in the disability space, but I think if Maria was here, she'd be able to say.
Yeah.
In terms of your anxiety about terminology, it's good that we want to get it right. Yeah. I think we say people with disabilities, people living with disabilities, putting the people first in terms of our languaging of it. But I would imagine a lot might depend on, on the abilities of staff to offer certain spaces, and I think different faculties may have different resources at their disposal, and might even depend to some degree on the nature of the degree. If you're required to do a lot of field work, for example, with certain disabilities, that may be more complicated. But I kind of speak under correction here. Is there anybody in the room who has a sense at UP of what our offerings are? Okay, but I think it's an interesting question to think about. Yeah. If we're recording this, we need your voice on the mic.
Sorry. I feel like in the humanities, I've seen people with different abilities and stuff like that. But I don't think I've seen much from other faculties personally.
I think, reflecting on Maria's ideas, I'm just thinking aloud here a little bit. Certain disciplines might say, well, we need our students to, if they're training to be doctors, they have to go into hospitals and they have to go to clinics, or if they're a vet, and therefore, there's a limit to what a person with certain disabilities can do. And I suppose if you take the view that the person with a disability is not the problem, but the system that makes certain possibilities more possible, if you take that view, then you change the way you think about doing a ward round or going out and to do field work, so that the focus becomes on the social and the structural rather than on the individual with the disability. So maybe different faculties might have to think about that more creatively rather than, it's impossible to accommodate person X or Y. Did you have a question here? Okay.
Thank you for your presentation. You have stated that less than 1% of the student population is people who are differently abled. And I think the problems that at basic education, for example, where I went to school, we had, I think, 3 blocks. So only one block had a ramp for a differently abled person. So the problem is that I think in our government, they think people who are differently able, they also have a learning disability. Because if that wasn't the case, we would have ramps in schools. So I think that's why we have less people at our institution. And one other thing, what did I want to ask? Okay, yeah, then that's all. Thank you.
Yeah, I think your point is well made, that discrimination towards people living with disabilities is endemic and is across multiple institutional spaces. And I would say the school is probably no exception. And I think that Maria makes that point in her monograph, is that universities, some people think that a person with a disability is learning disabled or intellectually impaired in some way, which is not true. There are certain disabilities come with intellectual impairment, but most of them don't. You remembered what else you wanted to ask?
Yes, I remembered. So when we fill forms, you usually find where they ask you about if whether you are disabled or not. They want you to state that. I'm just putting this question to the floor, like, do you guys think that's a good thing, or maybe it's discriminatory towards people who are differently abled? It's just a question to the floor.
That's a good. Well, I could have a brief comment on that, which is, first of all, if you ask people to self-define in some way, to say something about themselves, the question always in my mind is, well, to what end? What do you want to do with that information? Because if you set up an expectation that if you tell us that you're a person living with a disability, then we can accommodate you, and these are the ways we can accommodate you, then, and you don't offer those accommodations, then why are you asking the question? And it's a bit like a debate we're having at the moment around trans and gender diverse students who are applying for the first time, is if we're asking people, and I think we are moving in that direction, to self-identify in terms of gender, the question that comes to me is, so what do we do with that information? And particularly around the residence offerings of UP, that if we're in discussions with the idea of a pilot study on having a kind of gender-neutral residence space, because I think if you're asking students to self-identify, but you're not offering services or options that then make that revelation, that self-disclosure valuable to the student, then you've just kind of used them in some way.
Oh, thank you very much, Pierre. Back here.
Oh, thanks.
Hi. Yes, I just wanted to start with a comment, I think, on Kitty's question about whether we should have a box on the application forms. Well, I think part of my mind thinks, well, because considering the needs that people with disabilities have, that might be necessary so that the university can kind of render the necessary service and help. But then a part of me also thinks, sensitivity-wise, perhaps it's something that we should consult people with disabilities and just find out if it's a sensitive matter, or if it's if the language is acceptable, that kind of thing. That's what I would think from my position. Just following your example in recognizing our position whilst discussing these issues. And the other question, I think, or rather, there was a comment on science and people with disabilities. I've tutored and worked in universities, the Department of Plant Sciences, and I know that there was a time I marked a script from a student who was visually impaired, and they had someone type out the answers, and some of the questions were adjusted, and I think for them in the way in which they could respond, and well, they did very well, firstly, and I think they were studying genetics. I'm not sure, I can't remember clearly, but then there was no lab component in the work they were doing. With genetics, for example, a lot of the work is very tutorial based. So it's about understanding concepts. It's about it's more tutorial, answering questions, tracing lineages, that kind of thing. There's no lab work involved. So it is possible for certain fields in science which might not have as much a focus on the lab component. But I still think it's possible, some of the advances we have, because we have advances in moving from the wet lab setting, that is when we're doing our experiments in the laboratory, where a lot of things are moving to computation and other work, and whether it's absolutely necessary that every student needs to be able to do the most basic chemistry experiments, or you just need to have a ground understanding. I think it's possible, but I'm speaking from my own position of just having been a student through undergraduate student through the faculty. So that is something that can be discussed, I believe.
That's fascinating, sort of asking what is possible, not just assuming that this is impossible. Because as you were speaking, I was thinking, well, certain laboratory experiments maybe if you're visually impaired you can't do, but if there's a change in how one can learn those things, then more is possible. Now, lady, there was a question down here.
Thank you so much for your time. I just wanted, it was more of a comment for me, that I've found that as a disabled person, I'm having to question whether people are willing to be identified as disabled for us to have the conversation going forward. And I say this because I think the conversation we're having in the room currently focuses more on physical disabilities. So people with mental disabilities or who are living with those challenges, most of the time they don't identify themselves as disabled. To partly answer your question, on the forms when you're applying for whatever and you asked if you have a disability, they'll ask you if it's your sight, if you're a wheelchair user, if it's anything like that, but they wouldn't ask if you are living with a mental disability. And then you get to the workplace and you're encouraged to disclose your mental disability. However, most of the time, people have found that in the end, it's weaponized against them, you know. So I can relate to that, because when I know that when I apply for a job and I mark that I'm disabled, chances of me getting a call back have decreased just by me saying that I'm physically disabled, because employers will think about what it will take for them to be reasonably accommodative for me to be in the workplace. And at the end of the day, it doesn't seem like it's worth the investment. You know, so accessibility, in as much as we want to say that we're making things better, we still have a long way to go, because prejudice is one thing that constantly reinvents itself. You know, so, and if it's not the physically disabled tomorrow, it's going to be somebody else. It's always shape-shifting. So we just need to be careful about that. But I'm glad that we're having these conversations.
Yeah.
And I hope that we keep having them, because
Indeed.
if anything that COVID has taught me is that we're not ready to be disabled as the world. I mean, the first lockdown, when people couldn't go to the beach, people lost their shit.
That's true.
So you're thinking, great, so you couldn't go to the beach that one time. When I have to think about going to the beach, I have to think, wait, so which beach has a ramp? And I live in the Western Cape, and where I am, there's literally one beach that I can think of that is accessible for me, you know. So let's when we're talking accessibility, we have so much work to do, because the structures, like you said, the universities, the corporates, we get Disability Awareness Month was from the 3rd of November to the 3rd of December. It was very nice reading all those slogans, you know, but knowing that it's all just talk.
Yeah.
It can be very exhausting, but hopefully things will change. COVID is not going anywhere. The lessons that we're supposed to be learning, we're not getting. And until we do, we're just going to keep repeating this. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. You said so many things there that I want to respond to. Almost like I think you were saying to us when we're getting freaked out about not going to the beaches, get a grip, people. It's not that hard. I do like your point about prejudice reinventing itself. I've often said that stigma, which I've come to learn and understand about through HIV work, is it just takes new forms. It's like a shape shifts. I think you used the phrase. And the idea that people with mental disabilities might not want to associate themselves with the word disabled made me think about, hopefully this is not too self-referential, but for many years I've struggled with a little bit of hearing in my right ear. I think I had a nerve infection when I was in my 20s maybe, and I just lived with it. I thought it was how I was. And eventually, about 5 years ago, I saw an ENT, and he said, you should probably wear a hearing aid. Those two words, I said, hell no. Hearing aids are for old people, right? And so I said no. And then a year passed, and then I thought, okay, I saw an audiologist, and she persuaded me to try out a device in my ear. I drove out of the hospital, and I never wore it again. And there's something had to change inside me, and I now do wear one. It's discreet as I possibly can make it, and it helps my hearing. But interestingly, I don't call it a hearing aid. I call it my hearing device. Because a device sounds so much more sexy than a hearing aid. Like hearing aids for an old person with a stick, whereas hearing device is like a cool, like the science is amazing. And my current audiologist talks about the technology. And when I go and visit her, she can work out now, the computer tells her how many hours a day I've worn the damn thing for the last year. In what circumstances? Was there any speech going on while I was listening? Was there music? Was I in a car? So she kind of like quite cleverly has seduced me with the amazing technology of it. So now I'm quite proud of myself that I wear it. So it's kind of like a journey of self-acceptance, yeah. Yes?
Okay, I like what you mentioned about
Thank you.
hearing device as well, because it, as much as someone might identify it as a disability, an invisible disability, and someone else might not know that they actually have an invisible disability. So with regards to what Kiriboni said about when you're applying to UP and they ask if you have a disability, the only options I saw there were yes and no. How about I don't know, or I'm not certain? Can we investigate that? Can you go to Student Health Services, just have a brief checkup, and take it from there? As someone who has an invisible disability, and I'm a very slow writer, right? So that affected me badly in my matric exam. It was going to affect me badly in my matric exams. But I didn't know that I had that until my educator saw that this person actually never finishes papers. And I didn't have a problem with that because I was performing above average. And that's all that mattered to me. So how can the university help me become a better person and help me give better results, and help them become a better institution as well?
You know, I mean, I love the idea of when students apply is to say, they could, for example, do you have a disability, or do you think you have a disability? Tell us about yourself. Write a few paragraphs. Write an essay, or let's have a conversation about it. But because I love that idea of offering people a space to engage with the ideas. But I can tell you, the people who run the systems will have a heart attack because they want boxes, neatness, systems, numbers. They can direct you. But as soon as you ask an open-ended question in an application, you have to have a way to interpret and do something with that information that is meaningful. Because if you ask people to expose themselves, but then you don't give them some way to then be heard and understood and engage with that information, then it's an exercise in what? I don't know. Making someone vulnerable, thinking they're going to get assistance and they don't. So maybe we have to rethink the way we think about the applicant. And similarly around gender, I mean, in the conversations we've been having with people who do the systems, is like they want to offer 3 words: male, female, agender. And I said, no. There's so much more complexity in gender. If you just give people those offerings, then you can say, we only have 3 categories of gender diversity, because that's all you provided people. But if you ask people to say, self-describe your gender identity, then you're going to get 1,000 different responses. What do you do with those?
Thank you, everyone, for your lovely questions. Online, we just have a comment from, I think it's Bawani Muchewa. They're saying, thank you for the presentation. I totally agree with change of mindset when it comes to inclusion of people living with disabilities. My observation is that most of us, we are still stuck with attaching disability to physical and ignore the other forms of disabilities. So basically what we were just elaborating now on the invisible disabilities and a possible way forward or options that could be considered by not just universities, right, but different people who might like to accommodate, which we should all do, accommodate people with different abilities. So thank you everyone for this lovely session. Pierre, we appreciate you doing the commentary. The monograph will be available definitely next year. It's at publication at the moment, and we look forward to continuing the discussion online as well. So that wraps up this session. We've got one more session left with Mr. Tarun and Naidu. We shall join you at 15:15, and we hope that you look forward to wrapping things up on a high note. Thank you.
Thanks.